Hands up who drives a hybrid. Well, then again, maybe you should keep both hands on the wheel. Hands up who has a hybrid dog, a labradoodle or a cockapoo. My dog's a hybrid, which is really just an excuse to show those who follow the podcast on YouTube pictures of Dolly, who's a rescue from Serbia. A bit wide-haired Vizsla, and also a bit something else, we're not quite sure. And so much more photogenic than me, face it. I'm a hybrid, Nordic, Irish, Hungarian. Roses are all hybrids. The only purebred English rose is the dog rose, which grows wild. Hybridity is everywhere in nature. Now, thanks to the pandemic, hybridity is everywhere in learning too. And for some people, that's a problem. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
In April, the Financial Times reported that the return of workers to offices in the UK had stalled for the first time since restrictions were lifted at the start of the year, and may well have plateaued at around 25 to 30% of capacity. Evidence from employers, transport authorities and the hit taken to city centre retailers is signalling a fundamental shift in work and living patterns as a result of the pandemic. Hybrid working is with us, it seems, for the foreseeable future, as is hybrid learning. This trend is a bit of a focus of anxieties in L&D, so we thought we'd invite a guest on the podcast who could give some help and advice to those in workplace learning struggling with the challenges presented by this slightly unexpected legacy of COVID. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of FACT, tell us about her.
Hack Facts.
Laura Lee-Gibbs is founder of and strategic digital learning consultant at LearnFox. She works with organisations to provide digital learning solutions to both internal and external audiences. Her speciality is helping L&D to select the right learning system, and it was in this capacity that you had her on podcast in episode 30.
So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes, working from home in your home in the West. What did we have her talking about this time?
In our last episode, John, your report from Learning Technologies Exhibition and Conference, you identified hybrid as quite a major theme in the industry at the moment. Speaker after speaker made reference to it, usually in negative terms, as something that was not only throwing up challenges, but that really seemed a little bit broken.
As someone who works day to day with her clients in organisations on digital transformation, I wanted to hear from Laura how hybrid is playing out on the ground. Is it really a major source of concern? How is it influencing their behaviour and their digital strategies? Most of all, can hybrid learning actually be made to work? Laura Lee-Gibbs, welcome to The Learning Hack. Your last appearance on the podcast was in October 2020 when, if I remember correctly, the UK was in full lockdown. I don't think we could say that COVID is now fully in the rearview mirror, but people are going back to the office, partially at least, and some aspects of working life are slowly getting back to something like normal. And we should say that many people have been attending their workplaces right through the crisis, nurses, delivery people, service sector, etc. However, as regards to the return of offices for people in white-collar jobs, which is what we're really talking about when we talk about the return to offices, a report in the FT recently showed that the initial rate of return had slowed and perhaps even plateaued in the UK. So we're clearly in a different world now with this group of workers. The world of flexible working, Thursday is the new Friday, Tuesday is the new Monday. The world of hybrid is definitely with us. And the message came across very clearly at Learning Technologies exhibition I went to in May, that hybrid is a major challenge for L&D now. But speaker after speaker was saying, hybrid isn't working. So to kick off, could you give us your reflections on the changes you've seen in your work with clients over the last 2 years and the sort of challenges hybrid is throwing up for learning professionals?
Yeah, of course. So what I've seen over the last couple of years is obviously during the pandemic, organisations had to adapt really quickly to the challenges they were facing. So whatever learning they were delivering, they just had to get it rapidly online in whatever way they could. So, that meant in a lot of cases moving what was done face to face very quickly into virtual instructor-led training sessions, just cobbling together, whether that's Teams or via Zoom, or putting resources up on the intranet in some cases for those organisations that didn't already have an LMS, for example. And what I've seen as people have gone back into the workplace and the hybrid working has started is that now those organisations are really starting to look at, well, what they did to get by during the pandemic isn't good enough, and they want to readdress their content strategy and how they can make the content more engaging. In a lot of cases, they would have had new starters joining the organisation and not meeting their teams that they work with face to face for in some cases for months, many months, in fact. And it's very difficult to engage those people into the culture of the organisation if the online training's just very dry, and they're missing out on all of that face to face, meeting different parts of the business and really getting engaged. So in a lot of cases, I've been speaking to organisations who have this challenge now, where they've adapted quickly at the time, they've done the best that they could, they've got by, they've survived, and now it's very much about re-looking at what they've done in terms of their content and looking at how they need to make that better. I've also seen in a lot of cases that organisations who maybe had an LMS in place and who again were in a better position than others that didn't, obviously, because they already had that infrastructure in place to rapidly train people in the way that they needed to during all the changes that happened. But perhaps the LMS has lacked a bit of TLC and is not being optimized in the best way that it could, for example, because people have had their mind on other things. So maybe it's lacked a bit of ownership or optimizing some of the kind of native functionality that's there. And then you've also got other organisations who are very fixated on, well, we need to get a platform or the right technology in place now that we've got a bit more time and maybe budget, to address this. But they can be quite focused on the technology aspect and maybe not fully thinking about the wider strategy and the actual audience of who it's for, and being very learner focused about it. And obviously there's challenges for L&D, but also L&D need to think about what the challenges are for their learners and be very learner focused, and ensuring that whatever solutions, whether content, technology, whatever they're getting in place, is going to deliver what is needed for the learners in the best way to engage them.
So I'm hearing that there is a bit of catch up to do when you talk about kind of induction of people who maybe haven't been in face-to-face situations at all, are disconnected from the organisation, and we see this across education and so on. In terms of the new changed situation we face with hybrid, what's the actual problem there? I mean, are we talking specifically about synchronous training events, where it might have been a classroom, then it became a kind of live virtual classroom, and now we have a kind of mix of both? Or does it affect asynchronous learning as well?
Well, I think a lot of organisations who haven't had the time to step back and think about the strategy have opted to go for more synchronous training without fully kind of realising the benefits of asynchronous and what that can do for them. So, for example, I'm working with one organisation at the moment whose trainers and SMEs are spending the vast majority of their week on countless, virtual ILT sessions, delivering the same content. Well, in fact, not the same, because consistency is obviously a real problem in the fact that it's, delivered in this way. And also inducting new starters and kind of giving them virtual FaceTime with senior members of the business. But that's not the best use of these people's time. It's not necessarily adding the most value, and the asynchronous aspects need to be factored in, so that, as well as it's so important to engage people and have that, FaceTime with key members of the business, of course, but some of it can be done by video asynchronously. You can be inducted to the environment, the working environment that you're going to be working in, even if you haven't seen it in person as yet, and you can get to understand what key members of the business do via video, and then maybe have like Q&A sessions run by that individual where the new starters can come in and actually be ready to ask some questions instead of tumbleweed when they have the opportunity. So I think I think probably organisations haven't had the chance to really step back and take a breath. Well, they're doing that now, to think how can they better optimise all of what digital learning can offer them in making the better use of asynchronous and synchronous to optimise people's time.
Yeah, so in a way it's thrown an extra dimension into the mix. You have to think about your synchronous and your asynchronous. You have to think about the people who are working remotely and the people who are in the office. So it's more complicated for strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So your speciality, I think I'm right in saying, is helping people buy the right technology and the right learning systems to meet their learners' needs. How does hybrid change the sort of technology they might need, or perhaps just the way that they deploy that technology?
Mm-hmm. So I think more than changing the technology that organisations need, it changes the approach they need to take to choosing the right technology. I think it does that in a couple of ways. So one is having the right mindset. So this is the organisational mindset that in L&D about how they're approaching selecting the right technology. So this is, for example, starting with the strategy rather than the solution. So instead of thinking, that was really hard, we need to get the right tech in place now, it's stepping back and taking a more holistic view. So it's not just technology, it's also people and content and the technology and how they all intersect together. And then the other part of this is also thinking about your strategy in terms of getting technology that can be future-proof for your organisation and the strategy. So where you want to be in the next couple of years. So it's right to take things a step at a time and improve on where you are now, so wherever you are in your particular journey. But where do you want to get to? What's the vision in the strategy? And how does that align with making sure that your technology you're choosing is future-proof? So that's thinking about some of the functionality that a platform might give you that quite rightly you might not want to use from day one, because you're probably not quite ready yet, but how you might want to use some functionality within your activation and kind of ongoing engagement strategies around it. So that might be things like, can it facilitate user-generated content, which might not be something you're going to do on the first day that you launch it. Are there social learning capabilities to get people engaging with one another, sharing experiences with their peers, that type of thing. Maybe is there functionality around, having a really powerful AI natural language search that can help people surface the learning that they need in the moment they need it in the flow of work. A lot of these things you might not be turning on, when you first launch, but year 2, year 3, definitely, could well be in your strategy. And I think that's really important to have that future proofing view. So the right mindset, thinking holistically about the strategy and thinking about the timeline and future proofing the technology. They've always been important, but I think now they're more important than ever because people have been shown how rapidly things can change and how volatile, the world can be.
I was going to say a lot of that, what you've just said, you possibly might have said to people 2 years ago, when when facing up to a kind of a procurement. How does hybrid actually alter that, or does it make it more important that they take a strategic, holistic view? Does it have particular kind of edges to it now that it didn't before? How much is the advice that you give changed, do you think, according to hybrid?
I think that the whole engagement of your people becomes so much more key, because you know people are dispersed, aren't they? So they're not all in the same location, depending on the people aren't always in the same location, but they tend to be a bit, before there was more FaceTime, wasn't there? So in the physical sense of that. So now people are more dispersed. Like I mentioned, people are starting and joining businesses, and without all of that induction and actually kind of getting ingratiated into the whole company culture. And so you're having to, L&D are having to engage people much more quickly and get them into the organisational culture, so that, to avoid that kind of churn in the first 6 months where, the job market's really strong as well at the moment. So there's no shortage of jobs for people that are skilled in specific niche areas. So I think the engagement strategy, like you said, that kind of wider strategy has always been important. It would have been important a couple of years ago, but it's even more important now.
Okay. And what kind of extra requirements does this throw on the technology? I'm not blowing my own trumpet here necessarily, but a while ago I wrote a paper about learning systems and how they had changed over the last couple of decades from being solely centered on an administrative system to something which now is purported to create a learner experience, and in some of the more sophisticated systems has elements of learning design built into it in a way that the original first sort of LMSs were mainly focused on the kind of administration side. So against that kind of long-term change in learning systems, what kind of spin has this new situation of hybrid thrown into the mix? Or does it actually have to change at all because of that? Or
I think what we've seen in the vendor market is there's been a lot of acquisitions going on. Whether that's kind of vendors adding other tools into their suite so that they can offer, a more, a bigger suite of solutions, I suppose, to organisations, or whether it's vendors getting more partnerships with content providers, so that when organisations are actually, starting with a system, it's not empty, and there's plenty of content that they can then pull in to curate. And if you're going to have maybe more decentralised administration of a system and authoring of a system, which might be more likely now in the hybrid world, you're going to want to make it as easy as possible for people for lots of different dispersed admins to do that, and not starting from scratch. So those content partnerships are really powerful, and the ability to kind of curate external content in with your own. What I think a challenge can be for some of the kind of big enterprise platforms is that the admin side can be really clunky on those systems, but then, some of those bigger vendors are then acquiring some, others, and kind of, I don't know what that's going to look like if they're going to, merge the functionality, or whether it's just going to be kind of suites of different products. But I think, it kind of depends on the organisation and the individual use case, because having a suite of products from one vendor, can have its benefits, of course, but also perhaps having a pick and mix approach of using different tools and, platforms to get what you're trying to do in the most kind of agile way can also, work. I think it depends on the size of the organisation a lot, and on what kind of resource internally they've got to manage it, and if their culture even is at the point where they can have that kind of decentralized administration, and whether they're at a point in their transformation to bring that in yet.
You look at a lot of systems in the course of your work, I'd imagine. How well has the vendor market in general coped with the changed needs of the market when it comes to hybrid? Because it has come up rather quickly in the terms of the kind of decision scales on which these large companies work. I mean, major systems can be a bit slow to change. They also have their own agendas about the acquisitions, which are kind of linked to, how they're funded, what the VCs or the private capital companies want from them. Have they been wrong-footed by this? I'm not expecting you to kind of dob anyone in particularly, maybe mention no names. What's your general feeling about how the vendor market has coped with this change to hybrid?
Like we've seen a lot of acquisitions going on. And I think the smaller, a lot of the smaller suppliers have jumped on this whole bandwagon of, calling themselves an LXP or an LMS/LXP hybrid or whatever, knowing that that's what organisations are being led to believe that they need to jump into. And it almost makes that kind of classification a bit meaningless now, I think. But yeah, I mean, like I mentioned with the content providers and more partnerships going on, I think that's been something that I've seen a lot of the vendors doing more. That is becoming a key part of their proposition, so that they're able to offer a fuller offering to their customers. I think probably where they have been probably most wrong-footed, though, as you say, is probably more around not being able to offer perhaps the strategic consultancy that can help an organisation actually pull together their wider strategy, because the vendors can be more focused on the software and the content and less focused on the services they provide. So, and that strategic consultancy piece is more important than it ever was probably now, because of the different challenges, and the complexity. And, I think that's probably an area that is potentially missing, and where vendors, they might have a suite of products, but that's not helping the organisations think about the wider strategy necessarily of how they're going to utilise those and optimise those in their particular use case and business.
Luckily, there are people like you around to help fill that vacuum, perhaps. I'm going to ask a question now which is going to seem to be arguing in the opposite direction, and I'm kind of aware that I do this quite often. This is slightly complicated, so bear with me. The thing we've heard for years from people like David Wilson and so on is that the LMS isn't basically a particularly difficult piece of kit to build. It's really quite a simple, in technological terms, thing to do. The difference between the smaller or mid-market systems and the really large systems is that the large systems have the kind of can deal with complexity around, for a multi-national organisation, doing all that kind of business of administration within different territories and different jurisdictions. So you might have, for instance, different rules around how you use learners' data in Germany and in the US. Smaller systems can't necessarily cope with all that complexity. The bigger ones can, and that's what you pay the extra for. Now, what it seems to me is that in the hybrid world, you are kind of adding a layer of complexity, as it were, to what formerly was perhaps a more simple situation. So is it possible that this plays towards the larger, more established players in a way, in the sense that they have more kind of complex, sophisticated systems? If you're adding, or is this, just too stupid and a typical Helmer kind of speculation? Does the fact that more complexity is now needed play towards the bigger, more established players, do you think? as you say, the smaller startups have been quicker off the mark to respond. But when it comes to dealing with kind of a global need, you're going to need a big platform to do it.
So what kind of complexities are you thinking that, that those bigger...
Well, just the general point is the configurability, the fact that you can cope with kind of, remote workforces, different territories. You have the ability to customize that much. Now we have a system where you've got a different type of audience, perhaps, in the people who work from home, from the people who work in the office. And you need to kind of...
I just wonder though, if just because you're working from home, you're still part of the same audience group that you were before, even when you were in the office. So you might be, in a certain country, in a certain region, in a certain department, in a certain role. So you're still part of all those same kind of group hierarchies that you would have been, previous to working from home. It's just that you're sat in a different room, in a different building, on a different chair. But your experience of the platform and of what L&D are delivering to you and making available to you is still going to be the same, because you still sit in the same place within the theoretical organisation, even if not physically. So I'm not sure that it particularly does kind of change that.
Perhaps, yeah. And there will be digital nomads who think, well, if I don't have to work in the office, I might as well be working from Sri Lanka. But those are going to be kind of a smaller number of people, I suppose. In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. So looking at the sort of processes you take people through in getting the right tech for their needs, you have a whole structure and way of approaching this. We kind of touched on this before, but more specifically, have your processes, or those processes that you're looking with, changed with the move to hybrid? If they have, do you have to put extra steps in there? Or is it a matter of that good advice you were always giving is now more relevant than ever?
Yeah, I think the second, actually, because although the business challenges will be different, for every organisation, the use case will be different. The steps that are needed to go through to ensure the right decisions are made are still the same, really. So, in terms of really thinking about the wider strategy, where you are now, where you're trying to get to, a realistic timeline for change, and the stages of transition that you might go on, then really understanding your audience. So really understanding, this one will be different for organisations now than it was for the same organisation a couple of years ago, because the audience's challenges will be different. But it's really, employing a bit of design thinking into empathising and getting in the shoes of your audiences, understanding what their common challenges are and what is going to motivate them. So those two things will look different now. So it might mean that more effort is needed to understand that. So, user surveys, learner surveys, interviewing key business stakeholders, trainers, SMEs, people in L&D, people across the business who are responsible for training, and really understanding from them in detail those challenges that they're having, because that's going to impact on what your audiences need, and then ultimately what kind of functionality might be needed within a learning platform, and how the content needs to be better designed to engage them to do what they need to learn how to do. So I think there might be more steps in terms of what an organisation wants to do in terms of getting into the shoes and mindset of their audience to really understand them.
Because the situation is more complicated, you need to work through that. You need to perhaps research the user and the user personas and user stories a bit more thoroughly.
But it's just, it's probably not enough for L&D to think about the user personas and the user stories themselves from their own experience or what they think, or going from their assumptions. So they need to challenge their assumptions by really, speaking to those users and really getting into the shoes of them. And also that plays into kind of piloting things and getting an MVP out and actually getting things into the hands of the users quicker to get some vital feedback. Because what I think assumptions, whatever assumptions you had will be challenged by the reality of how things actually are, for people out there.
That absolutely makes sense, I think, because so many we've been in a very new situation over the last couple of years. So many new problems and challenges have come up that you probably didn't anticipate. And you've seen such things such as, I know teachers have said to me that everything having to be virtual in terms of the teaching for a while really sharpened sort of class divides and so on, so that some kids just didn't have a computer, or there was one computer in the house and somebody had to use it to work on, so they had to share time between working and learning. I mean even in a lot of middle class households this has been the case, whereas other people might have their own room, and you hear about young people in organizations working from home having a lot of difficulty because of their lack of space, and they're kind of balancing a laptop on their lap, sitting on a bed, trying to do. It's not the same as someone like me who's got a garden room with these computers set up. And those aren't things you can second guess. In other words, it needs research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did a big project with a multi-academy trust who were running 20 schools, and this was last year. And actually, one of the key things that came out of that, from doing a lot of surveys and business stakeholder interviews, was, like you say, some of those key kind of hardware issues that, people not having access to laptops and, Wi-Fi, like you say, multiple people in lockdowns all using the Wi-Fi at home, for example. But I think another thing that was really interesting is that actually not to ignore the things that did go well. So actually to ensure that when you're doing this kind of interview process, make sure you're saying what has been working, like since you've had to adapt during the pandemic, what's worked really well, and what do you want to take from that and see more of. And, because not everything has just been a kind of make do and survive. There have been real success stories of certain strategies and things that have worked better, and it's important, I think, not to ignore those and to actually take those forward and and to kind of make people realize and feel appreciated for doing a good job and building on that.
So, Laura, there's a perception in the industry that hybrid isn't working for learning, but how often do you find now clients coming to you with this as a priority challenge? Hybrid isn't working, we need to nail it. Does that come up a lot with your clients?
No, I don't find that is a priority objective for clients that I'm talking to at all. So what I find are the key challenges that I'm hearing about are that people had to adapt really quickly in whatever way they could, cobbling together what they could using the tools that they had in place, whether that was an LMS or not. And now they finally had that time to kind of step back and think, well, we either need to engage our users, our learners, better, and rethink how we're delivering our content, so it's not, still an appropriate use of people's time to just be doing, the kind of live virtual instructor-led stuff, and they need to think about different approaches like flipped classroom and, having more on-demand and asynchronous content. Or it's about maybe optimizing the platform that they've had in place and that's a bit stale, and making better use of the functionality to enhance the user experience. But usually it's because they've gone off on one kind of route, and that might be being very fixated on, we need a platform, or we need to digitize our content, but they're just not thinking about the bigger picture because they haven't had time to until now. And so that's really what I'm seeing. And, the kind of key challenges are around a lot of new starters joining the business and just not getting, kind of engaged with the company culture, because they're just not meeting their team at all. But that's probably the key common challenge to lots of different businesses in different industries. But it doesn't tend to be a kind of key driver that organisations are saying, hybrid's not working, what can we do? It's just, no, it's not.
Okay, so it's more about where they were before the pandemic hit, in terms of a lot of them weren't, that far advanced up the curve. Then suddenly they had to move really quickly, and now they're sort of picking up the pieces and trying to work out how to make it work in a new situation, rather than this perception hybrid isn't working, which seems to be widespread in the conference circuit, perhaps, but isn't necessarily there on the ground. Interesting.
It might be connected to people just having that kind of fatigue of doing so much online, because all our meetings are online and things. But, I think even with that, there's ways of using different delivery methods so that you don't have to always have a meeting to discuss everything. If you're trying to move an idea on with colleagues, you can, do a quick video for a few minutes and share that, and people can all have watched that before you have the meeting. So, I think there's loads of different things that are actually very applicable to the way we deliver learning. But I think it just might be a general fatigue with hybrid working and so much online and kind of, looking at people on a screen.
So what are your top tips for making sure, if you're a head of L&D in a company, or working as a learning professional with a company, for making sure that you have the right tech systems for learning in a hybrid environment?
So top tips would be, so I think like a product manager rather than a project manager. So this plays into that whole start with a minimum viable product. So whatever it is, whether it's, you're just trying out a new way of delivering some content, or whether it's, launching a new platform, whatever it is, always start with, your MVP and get that into the hands of your users as quickly as possible, so that you can get their feedback and their input into it and refine what you're doing. So definitely think like a product manager and not a project manager, where you're perhaps planning and kind of trying to get to perfection before getting something out there, because I think that input from the actual learners themselves is really vital. I think with the content side of things, remember that with digital learning, it's not just e-learning, it's not just SCORM packages, and there's so much more that you can do with digital learning in terms of kind of micro learning and utilizing lots of different delivery formats that can speed up getting to a point of getting good content out to people. And it can also help with that decentralized content creation aspect as well, because you're not having a learning curve of people having to know how to use external authoring tools, and also it's accessible because you can make it all searchable and more surfaceable in the flow of work as well. And I think thinking about your content strategy up front as to what kind of delivery formats are you going to want to use, and what kind of native functionality within a platform is going to facilitate the delivery that you want as well is really, really key. So yeah, content strategy, then really getting into the shoes of your audience and doing all that work up front to understand what their challenges are.
I hear what you're saying about the MVP and get it out there, get feedback, iterate kind of approach. Mm-hmm. Is there always a slight danger in that when you go for an MVP, typically you de-scope, so you kind of knock some of the bells and whistles off, and there is a tendency to concentrate, let's just get something out there that fulfills the 70 to 80% of need. And then the thing that gets knocked off the edge is that, we have these remote learners who are working at home. Maybe we haven't catered for them because we just want to get the big simple thing working. Is that a danger to avoid?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you probably need to, think of MVPs in terms of for a particular audience. So, clearly those people working at home can't be ignored because that's a key challenge at the moment. So it might be that you're launching your system in an MVP capacity, but when you're thinking about the content that you'll be launching with, you're making sure that all of your key audience groups are catered for, and you're just, rather than thinking about all of the content that you need to get onto your platform, you're just focusing on some key kind of pieces that can add the most value, but not ignoring any of your audience groups. Because but depending on your I suppose objectives of what you're doing, but no doubt the remote workers and the hybrid workforce will be a key part of that.
Thanks very much for that. I think it's been a really interesting quick scamper through some of the issues around hybrid, and it's certainly kind of upped my level of understanding of the challenges. Lastly, what's the best place or places to go for people who need some help with hybrid and want to find out more?
So I've developed a diagnostic tool that can be a real help to understanding an organisation's readiness to selecting the right platform. So it's totally free, takes a couple of minutes or 3 minutes, no more than that, to complete 20 quickfire questions, and it will give some tailored, personalised results about what you should be thinking about in terms of your strategy, and some actionable steps. So there's that diagnostic tool. There's also a clinic that I provide that can help an organisation and key stakeholders get together and actually consider those key areas of the people, content, and technology, and an actionable kind of roadmap of what they need to do in terms of their digital learning transformation. One aspect of that might be, selecting a platform, but there's many other aspects that will come out in that strategy. And then thirdly, I've created an online academy called the LearnFox Den that's got lots of how-tos and downloadable templates and content around going through a digital learning transformation. So including things like digitizing content and platform selection and the art of the possible in terms of what is achievable. And those can be found on the LearnFox website.
Okay, and we'll put links to all those in show notes for people. So thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Laura and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Our next episode tells a fascinating story about learning in a part of the world that has been much in the news recently, and not in a good way. It's called Georgia on My Mind, but this isn't the Georgia sung about by Ray Charles and James Brown. It's the other one.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.